So you're just beginning your research on getting your pilot's license, and now you've chosen a flight school that has Cessna 152s and Cessna 172s. Which one should you choose and why? Well, it's Caleb here from Air 101, and we're gonna talk about it. I'm gonna briefly talk about the aircraft themselves throughout this video, but since there are already so many videos and articles online about that, I'm gonna talk more about my experience of flying and training at a flight school in a Cessna 152 and a Cessna 172, so that you can make a more informed decision on which one you should choose. And today we're also gonna talk to somebody who had an opportunity to do their first training flight in a Cessna 172, and they're going to tell us a little bit about their experience. Also, if you make it all the way through to the end of this video, I'm going to talk about, from the insurance aspect, which aircraft is better to train on so that you can upgrade to a bigger and more complex aircraft such as a Beechcraft, Comanche, or a Cessna 210. Okay, let's get to it. I personally started off training in a Cessna 172. As you may or may not know, it is a 4-seater aircraft that is perfect for training in. It has a good amount of useful loads so that you can take larger people in it. Now, I actually started training in a Cessna 172, not because I'm that tall or heavy, but instead I wanted to bring some friends with me so that they could also enjoy the experience too. So I ended up doing my first roughly 20 hours in a Cessna 172, and it was absolutely awesome. Now, the Cessna 172 had enough power with its Lycoming 0320 engine with 150 horsepower. It was comfortable, but funny enough, because I'm only 5'8", I always had to use a couple books behind my back so that I could comfortably use the foot pedals. Maybe I just have really short legs or something, I just don't really know. Maybe it'll be totally fine for you if you're only 5'8". But what ended up happening is more and more people wanted to come with me on my training flights and sit in the back of the Cessna 172. They would come and ask me and say, can I please come on the training flight with you? So the owner of the flight school actually noticed this was happening quite often, and he said it was great for the first couple of flights, but then he said maybe I should switch to the Cessna 152 because then I can focus on my flight training instead of worrying about passengers the whole time. And you know what? He was right. At this point, I continued my flight training in a Cessna 152. As a student pilot, it really only took me an hour or two to transition into comfortably flying the Cessna 152. First things I noticed while flying the Cessna 152, of course the obvious was it only had 2 seats in it, and the cabin was a lot smaller. But to be honest, it felt very cozy in there and was still comfortable to sit in and fly. In saying that, it is a little bit more difficult to get into the Cessna 152 compared to the Cessna 172. But once you are in the aircraft, it's all good. Also, once again, since I'm only 5'8" and roughly around 180 pounds at that time, it made it perfect for me to fly the Cessna 152 with a flight instructor. After my first couple of flights, I actually realized how much I enjoyed flying the Cessna 152, maybe even more than flying the Cessna 172. It was lighter, smaller, and personally, I felt easier to fly. In the Cessna 152, since it had a smaller engine, a Lycoming 0235 with 110 horsepower, it had less power, which at times in the summer was actually a little bit more difficult with the slower climb rate, high humidity, etc. But I ended up learning some really cool things from my flight instructor, such as using ridge lift to catch the wind going up a mountain to gain altitude really fast, and catching the air thermals from hot air rising. Now, obviously you don't want to rely upon these things in everyday flights, but it was something really cool that I got to experience while flying the Cessna 152. By the time I ended up doing my cross countries, I ended up using the 172 because it was a little bit faster and more comfortable to fly for those longer flights. Now you may wonder, did it slow down my training when I was switching from the 172 over to the 152 and back to the Cessna 172 for my long cross country? And the answer is no. I still ended up finishing my pilot's license in 49 hours, and it took me roughly 2.5 months. But now my recommendation is this: after you finish your long cross country and you're preparing for your flight test, just pick either the Cessna 152 or Cessna 172 and stick with that aircraft until you finish your flight test. This way you'll really know the aircraft inside and out and fully know the POH, or Pilot Operating Handbook. This will go a long way on your flight test and will really help you out. I ended up continuing my training on a Cessna 152, did my PPL test on it, and it was a great experience. Now here is one last thing to think about when choosing which aircraft to train on: the cost of either training on a Cessna 152 or a 172. Lots of people say you'll save a lot of money if you train on a Cessna 152 instead of a Cessna 172. Well, is that really true? Well, let's quickly do the math together. For a Cessna 152, depending on the flight school, they'll roughly charge you $158 per hour for solo training and $231 an hour with a flight instructor. And for a Cessna 172, depending on the flight school, they will roughly charge $175 an hour solo and $248 an hour with a flight instructor. So what does this mean for you? Let's say that you do your whole license in a Cessna 152 instead of a Cessna 172, just to save some money. And let's say you end up finishing your license in roughly 65 hours. 65 hours times $17, that's the difference between the cost of flying the Cessna 152 compared to the 172, equals $1,105. So in the end, you will only be saving $1,105 if you train in a Cessna 152 instead of a Cessna 172, and it took you roughly 65 hours to finish your license. In the end, you are saving a little bit of money, but not that much money. So realistically, I wouldn't necessarily pick the aircraft you want to train on just because of cost savings. Because let's say you're trying to save money, but you're taller and larger, but still decide to train in a Cessna 152. You have to do every flight at half tanks, and then you end up having to do shorter flights, and it can be a real pain. So in this case, I would recommend just flying in a Cessna 172. Now, after hearing all of this, what aircraft should you choose? A Cessna 152 or a Cessna 172? And I know some people are gonna say neither. Pick a Piper PA-28. So the answer to that question is, it is really just up to you and your preference. Do you want a slightly bigger aircraft or a slightly smaller aircraft? Do you want to fly a 4-seater aircraft or do you want to fly a 2-seater aircraft? Are you slightly taller and heavier? Do you possibly want to save roughly $1,000 to $1,500 by choosing a Cessna 152 instead of a Cessna 172? Do you possibly want to bring passengers with you when you're doing your cross countries with your flight instructor? This list could go on, but hopefully this gives you a good idea on which aircraft you should choose when doing your flight training. Now we have something special for you today. Check out what Angela Mann had to say about her first training flight in a Cessna 172. So Angela, I know that you love aircraft and that you love aviation, and you've been doing aircraft insurance for roughly 10 years. And I also know that you did your first training flight in a Cessna 172. So I want to ask you, how did you like doing your first training flight in Cessna 172, and what was your flying experience like?
I loved going in the 172. I mean, first of all, for my first flight, it was nerve-wracking and exhilarating. I mean, doing the pre-flight inspection, actually flying and taking off. There's so many different, stimulations, the instrument panel, and making sure there's no other aircraft. I loved everything about it. It was the greatest experience. Would I do it again? 100%, I would go again. It was awesome.
That's awesome. I'm glad that you enjoyed that first flight so much. Now, I've taken you up in a Cessna 150, which is similar to a Cessna 152. So I want to ask you, what did you really notice the difference between flying a Cessna 150 and flying in a Cessna 172?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the biggest difference is going to be the space. How comfortable are you in the 150, having your co-pilot, your instructor right beside you, as opposed to in the 172 where there's a lot of room. You've got the passenger seats in the back. You can take your friend in the back. That's the biggest thing. I mean, with the carrying capacity, with the fuel, obviously the 172, you can go a little bit farther with your flight training if that appeals to you. I prefer the 172 over the 150 just for the space aspect of it, but they are such similar planes. It really just depends. It's personal preference.
Yeah, that's kind of how I feel as well. Obviously, I am a little bit biased to the 150 because I have roughly 200 hours in it, and it's nice and cozy and flying it, that 1974 50 Cessna 150L. But I totally agree. It's nice having the 172 for longer flights, etc. Now, that I ended up making a video on Trevor Jacob jumping out of his aircraft with a parachute. Now, I have to ask you this question. If you were in a similar situation and you were wearing a parachute in a Cessna 172 and you had an engine failure, what would you do?
Yeah, for sure. Obviously, my first thought would not be to jump out of the plane. I would do whatever I could to try to save my aircraft. Having the parachute is my fail-safe at the end. I mean, I would be looking around to see where could I possibly land. I've got enough altitude that I can look for any grass strip, gravel bar, anywhere that I could possibly try to land. I would rather land than take my chances jumping out of the plane. That's my personal opinion on that. To do whatever you could to save that plane. Jumping out with a parachute, no, that's not for me.
Yeah, and don't wear fire extinguishers around.
Don't wear Don't wear a fire extinguisher and don't film yourself jumping out.
Great answers. It's been awesome having you, and it's nice to hear your experience flying the Cessna 172.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me.
Now, thanks for sticking around and making it to the end of this video, because this is very important, and this is one of the most common questions I get from people when they're doing their private pilot's license. A student pilot usually calls in and says, I'm looking at either buying a Mooney or a Beechcraft or a Cessna 210 after I finish my license. And then they proceed to ask me, should I train and do my license on a Cessna 152 or a Cessna 172 so that I'll be able to get insurance for the aircraft I want to buy afterward? The answer to this question realistically is it doesn't actually matter if you train on a Cessna 152 or a Cessna 172. Let's say that you do want to buy a Cessna 210 afterwards, or a Mooney or a Comanche. When you're applying for insurance, the insurance company is going to look more at what your total time is, your flying experience, etc. And listen closely to this. If you are a low-time pilot who has just got your PPL, then I recommend that you find a good aviation insurance broker who will work with the insurance company to put together a training program so that you can buy the machine that you actually want to upgrade to. Finding insurance for an aircraft is more about finding a good training program and a good flight instructor, or sometimes a qualified commercial pilot who is willing to do 10, 20, 30 hours dual with you in the aircraft you want to buy. If they are a qualified flight instructor or possibly a qualified commercial pilot, then there is no reason why the insurance company shouldn't insure you on a Mooney or Comanche, Cessna 210, Diamond DA40, even a Cirrus SR20 or Cirrus SR22. All I can really say is this: both the Cessna 152 and the 172 are great aircraft to train on. So stop worrying about which aircraft you're gonna go train on, but instead just go and have fun. Finish your pilot's license, because this is gonna open a whole new world to you, a world of aviation. Now, maybe you don't have a lot of money and you're possibly wondering how to do your pilot's license on a budget. If so, then you should watch this video right here. I really hope that you learned something from this video today. Have fun doing your pilot's license, stay safe, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.